So, fool, now you confront me. Throughout your pitiful little quest, I have placed the obstacles and barricades before you that slowed your approach. You may have scored minor victories along the way, but ultimately, it was futile. It was all in preparation to get you to this point, where you would stand against me, your nemesis. The one driving goal that has brought you to this point. To defeat me? You think you have a chance. And look, I brought along a spectator for the audience. Do you recognize it? Do you recognize the kinship in the structure, the bone? Ah, yes, the face that it once wore. Was it your father? Someone from your village? I don't know, don't care. Honestly, it could be anybody that you once knew. Ah, yes. Here we are, the final battle. You all ready? You're ready to match power against the Dark Lord himself? Come, test your skills against me. I am your ultimate challenge, and you are doomed to fail. And only on the end of this journey, this breaking point, you will realize the futility of your actions, and you will find yourself in the Lair of OmnusI. Greetings, heroes. Welcome once more to the Lair of OmnusI. I am OmnusI, your host, welcoming you into the depths of my realm. Level 7 is all about us now. The imps have mined out and cleverly crafted the rooms and chambers, traps, and some monsters have let themselves in, making it very homey. Of course, they are but pawns in a greater landscape that has been lovingly crafted by myself, the master of the lair. Any adventurer who would seek to tame this level would, of course, occupy their time with the assorted traps and with those minions that dwell within. But to truly master it, they would have to defeat the evil that rests at the center of the dungeon. And perhaps they might be strong enough to do so. As far as delving into a dungeon and finding the biggest and the nastiest or most cleverly powerful creature, that is certainly no small undertaking. However, for a true story, one must have a true villain to compare one's power against. You see it again and again. And here in this level, level 7, we will delve into crafting the suitable big, bad, evil guy for your stories. I hope you're strong enough. This one may get messy. In many great stories of cinema or literature, the quality of the story directly impacts upon the adversarial force that the characters must confront. This often is encapsulated in a single entity or an organization, or perhaps an entire nation, that will serve as the foil for the characters throughout the narrative. Now, not all adventures have such a entity, and role-playing games are much the same. You may have, for instance, a sandbox style game in which the players drive the narrative and there's no one storyline that is the right storyline. Those are becoming rather popular these days. But one of the tried and true formulas for making a role-playing game still includes some sort of nemesis that the players will have to struggle against. In the short term, in a single adventure narrative, like a module or a short connected piece, like a dungeon crawl, there may be a single, what might be called a boss, monster, or villain. Something that the players will have a challenge taking on. The strongest or the most clever or powerful creature in the area. Perhaps that controls that given area. And for the most part, those are the encounters that will involve the majority of the time in preparation. Usually these characters are going to be significantly more powerful than the monsters around them. You do want to set an ebb and a flow of the energy of your adventure, and that is the payoff, the big reward, the climax, as it will. The players will actually expect that because that is the way that most of our adventure stories work. There's an introduction, there's crises, resolution, advancement of the plot, and character development. Finally, at the end, there is the final climax, which is usually going to resolve the conflict in one way, shape, or form. And if the heroes win, that's where they do it. And an adventure that is spelled out that way will meet with your players' expectations, because culturally that's kind of what we've grown to expect. A well-crafted boss or end adventure villain, as I said, should take up a fair amount of the player's resources to best, may involve some sort of cleverness, and may have some sort of environment that makes the encounter more memorable. This is all an admirable goal when designing an individual dungeon or adventure, and many of them flow in just such a fashion. Oftentimes also, this particularly difficult encounter will also be where the majority of the treasure and reward for taking on that particular story will bring you to. So you will obviously get the best reward typically from the final challenge, or the strongest challenge of the area. Now, that's all fine for crafting an individual adventure. But if you're thinking about a campaign and spinning an ongoing narrative, it's a good idea to think about the end point fairly early on, for several reasons, which we will go into. The first reason why somebody should think about the end villain is because it puts a cap on how long your story is intended to go. For instance, using an example of a game like Dungeons and Dragons, if you make the end boss a suitable challenge for a party of, say, 12th level adventurers, you are effectively capping your storyline at around 12th level. If that's what you're comfortable with, that's a good strategy to go with. If you are going with a more sandbox approach, then this may not be as useful, but it's still not a bad idea to have some challenge that the players will eventually test themselves against when they get around to it. If you are telling a narrative story, this villain may be used again and again at various points, so setting it up in advance as the villain will give that encounter more punch when you get to it. So, the first rule about crafting the big bad evil guy is to understand your limits and knowing the limits of how far you want to go with that campaign. You ideally will want to make that being, encounter, what have you, something that will really test the player characters when they get to that point. And it can be something that you tinker with throughout a campaign. Honestly, watching the villain grow alongside of the player characters can be quite rewarding, and especially so when the player characters don't completely know that that character is going to be the big bad evil guy. For instance, one of the classic stories of adventure is when a sympathetic NPC runs afoul of something. Perhaps they get possessed by a magical sword that turns them evil, or perhaps they have a crisis of faith that causes them to radically change their outlook and become contrary to the player characters. Perhaps it's an old friend who suddenly turned bitter and puts themselves at odds against the players. These are all different sources that you can use to craft a personal nemesis for your storyline. Now, the term big bad evil guy often means that the entire end of the resolution for this character is going to involve some sort of combat. Hence, the big and bad typically means that there's no doubt that this character is the nemesis. It's easy when your characters wear an evil mask, prance about with the skulls of loved ones, and boast about how they're going to control the world and what have you. That's not bad. Those are archetypes that are fun to pull out of the closet every now and again, and it's sometimes nice to tell a story where the players get to save the world against the evil villain. That's, all well and good. Depending on how fresh your players are or how jaded they are, you have a vast variety of resources and archetypes that you can use to develop your own big bad evil guy. We'll only touch on a few of those because honestly the selection is nearly infinite. And every time you watch a new movie or you read a new book, you might be inspired on a different way that a new big bad evil guy, from now on abbreviated BBEG, may be created and developed. Now, some of the other things to think about when developing this type of character. Another good guideline is to make the character flawed. Now, it's relatively simple if you make the character a victim. For example, the person who gets that cursed sword and turns evil, or that person who has this crisis of faith, perhaps they see an unjust act and it drives them mad, something like that. That flaw is going to be their psyche, their psychological purpose that twists their passions. Sometimes it may be something physical. For instance, if, say, your nemesis turns out to be a vampire lord. Well, vampires are powerful monsters, but they have weaknesses. And perhaps, if that character is an intelligent character, they may seek to mitigate those advantages, which makes the players have to work harder to maintain the integrity of those advantages against the big bad evil guy. For example, a vampire who wants to find a way to bathe the land in eternal night, or at least the land around himself so that he can't be killed with sunlight, would make the players then attempt to stop the plans of that vampire. Or, for instance, another one whose power is tied to a great artifact would attempt then to hide or destroy the means to destroy that artifact, which the players can then be made to work to root out, rescue, or prevent the destruction of. It can be sometimes very easy if you include some sort of a weakness. Let the player characters work to find out what that is, and then work to exploit that against their enemy. So, also another thing that is a common trap, if you don't include that weakness, then the final battle generally will just devolve into a slugging match. Give the big bad evil guy a ton of hit points to hack through, or massive armor that makes it nearly difficult to harm, unless the players get really lucky or really creative. That may be fun for some. However, giving your character, giving your nemesis some sort of weakness, brings a level of interest and adds a level of strategy that you can use to make your story a little bit more interesting. It could certainly be used, at the very least, to give your characters a few more goals and things to do. Now, on top of that, though, you have to make sure that that big bad evil guy is still going to be big enough to challenge the players. And I don't necessarily mean that in a combative sense. Obviously, you don't want him to be smoked in one round when they finally get around at the end of your story. That character, if it's got any value at all, should have some means of controlling the situation, at least as far as his own conscience or its own conscience will dictate that it has a certain amount of safety from the player characters or against, life in general. If it isn't powerful or it isn't a threat, it does tend to lose some of its fangs. Some of the impetus to make sure that it's ended and finished is lost if it's just an average Joe, not very powerful. So it should be suitable to the challenge. If you're telling a relatively short story, say on an interpersonal low-level scale, then a character like say, Sheriff of Nottingham would be a challenge for a reasonably powered, say, low fantasy group of charming outlaws and rebels like Robin Hood. That character could be a big bad evil guy. It doesn't always take a galaxy-spanning dictator to be that big bad evil guy. Another thing that can be entertaining is by challenging the expectations. For instance, it's oftentimes not the evil king or emperor that's the real threat. Quite often there's a power behind the throne that's the real threat. The apparent big bad evil guy may be a dupe, a shell, an outer shell for the true power. And if the players get a chance to find that out in advance, it can be nice to let them, really get into the meat of the story and possibly be able to find that out in advance. On the other hand, it can be a fun twist when the players get to the point where they have their sword at the throat of the king and realize he doesn't know how to defend himself because, well, he's not the real threat. A plot twist like that is something that is perhaps not the exclusive domain of the big bad evil guys in a story, but it certainly makes for a memorable one when the player's expectations go one way and then you twist in another direction. I mean, everybody remembers that scene in The Empire Strikes Back. Luke, I am your father. And I hope that's not a spoiler alert for you. But that kind of a twist is something that adds yet more punch to the character. Leaving it all out on the table and making the character, the threat, obvious can be rewarding too. But if you make your character a little bit more complex, that adds memorability and punch. Now, another thing that is a fairly useful tactic when using this sort of character is not to pull your punches as far as what the villain can do. unless you're going for that kind of a gray area thing where the player characters are faced with a great deal of morality questions. If you're telling straightforward fantasy, or you are playing in a game that has black and whites as far as morality goes, look to the classics like Star Wars. Again, there's no doubt of which side is evil. Look to Dragonlance Chronicles by Hickman and Weiss. The dragon armies are clearly evil, unapologetically so. They're there to conquer everything. And the good heroes will fight back against that by their very nature. Not always for the great rewards, it's because there's an evil to be fought against and they'll step up to do it, even if it costs. So, making that big bad evil guy evil enough can be very useful. Now, a couple of ways that you can do that are, again, borrowing from literature. You can, of course, give them great power by putting them at the head of an empire which, by its own actions, demonstrates evil behavior, either tyrannical or a lust for conquest, and a rather comfortable level with brutality. Those are all good hallmarks that tell when somebody in power is going to be an evil that can be challenged. If you move away from that, there's any number of obvious means that you can make somebody appear evil. Again, an inhuman skull-like mask, parading around with the undead, having trophies. There's any number of ways that you can let the player characters know when you're not being subtle anymore that somebody is truly evil. And when it gets to that climax, the player character should be pretty sold on the fact that they need to do this. They need to beat this great evil. And that on the completion of that, that is the completion of their stated goal. Another thing, too, on top of that, is that character, that big bad evil guy, should somehow color the entire campaign. Star Wars would not be the same without the omnipresent threat of the Empire overhead. That touches every single aspect of what goes on. These characters sometimes dislike each other to a strong degree, and would love nothing better than to separate, but they have to stay together to get the job done against the evil Empire. I'm going to draw on that as a common trope, but honestly, it's such a good story, and it's so central to the adventure experience. I really don't mind using it a few times. But we can drift away from that to other adventure stories. For example, most James Bond spy films will generally start out putting the player characters, or putting the central character in a position where you're introduced to him and what he's like. Usually getting in danger and then ending up with a lovely lady, and then the opening credits roll, and then they start up building the challenge for the character, putting them in the scenario, putting Bond, where he's going to be going next, and then through that we get different clues about who the actual evil is. And moving on, the escalation of the threat, and so on. Those are all things that you can use in your games as well. Now, once you have a villain in mind, you have a general idea of what power level that you want to make him. I would recommend against throwing every single ability in the book at that character. There's a few reasons for that. Number one, if you're playing a game like, say, we'll go back to Dungeons & Dragons. If you have a 12th level character, for frame of reference, we'll say in the current edition, in 5th edition, if you have a 12th level character, and say you've made your villain, for purposes of this, a powerful wizard. At 12th level, a wizard is going to have a lot of spells. Quite a few. Now, having a spell book for that character isn't very useful for a few reasons. Number one, that character is probably not going to have access to all the spells that he could know. Number two, out of the spells that he's memorized, in the course of a battle, unless you intend to run this really long running battle, he's not going to get to be able to use all of those powers. Ideally, it's good to know what the character will open with, certainly. And if you throw in a twist or two, that might extend out the encounter. But honestly, knowing down to every single 1st level or 2nd level spell that character knows doesn't really help you much. It just gives you more to look through. Or knowing how many daggers he has on him. It just doesn't matter. It's something that's only useful when they loot the body. Now, obviously, your treasure assortment and everything else like that should be considered, because if the big bad evil guy is intelligent, he'll use the resources at hand. If the players think that something will be useful, the chances are the villain had a good reason to have it and will probably use whatever is at hand as well. Prying that magical sword out of the hands of the villain after you've bested him is certainly a memorable way of treasuring an item that you fought hard for. But to the same point, again, remember, avoid details like individual features like that. It just makes more of a challenge for you when you're running the story and you have other things that you can be concentrating on. So, beyond that point, it's also a good idea with villains to treat them differently than other characters. For instance, it's important to know the combat stats of a villain, of course. But the villain should also have more consideration for things like dialogue, for a more complicated strategy, like an exit strategy that gets them out of danger of what they can consider. In addition, it's also a good idea to think about how the character's mental flaws and consideration are going to affect their scenario. For instance, a megalomaniacal villain may not think of the exit strategy, convinced that he or she could defeat any threat that comes before them. And the epiphany that would have been a good idea may be something that really makes players look back on the encounter and kind of laugh at how they were able to exploit the fact the villain never considered the possibility of their own failure. That also has some links in with other notorious villain built-in opportunities for failure and loss, such as the ever-popular self-destruct button. If they never thought that anybody would be clever enough to use their self-destruct button on their ultimate weapon, and the players end up going, oh, the self-destruct button, while they're in the middle of the final challenge. That may also be a more interesting way than just having beaten down the villain and all you remember is that you rolled a lot of dice and you took down their hit points and you ended up winning. Winning by short-circuiting their plans of victory and being clever oftentimes are just more rewarding. So, those are some important things to consider when constructing the encounter itself that the big bad evil guy will be in. You want to build it up to a certain level. You want to, when you're framing it, you want this to be the epicenter of what the players drive their characters to. And it should be worthy of the journey. If you're running something relatively small scale, it doesn't have to be epic. But if you are running a story that covers multiple years, it should be something pretty memorable. So, that's the encounter itself. Now, the campaign that has this big bad evil guy, as I said, should have their thumbprints on the whole story. The characters can use occasional reminders from the evil's minions, or even occasional visits from the stronger foes, lieutenants, or some sort of signature creature or monster. Remember, one of the great stories of adventure, Lord of the Rings, no one goes toe-to-toe with Sauron in the story. There's just the reference of Isildur cutting his finger off and taking the ring. But nobody fights Sauron. Doesn't happen. Those Nazgul, on the other hand, when they make an appearance, it's certainly memorable. And in such a way, you can also avoid having to pull out the big bad evil guy, but have some proxy there that keeps the players knowing that that big bad evil guy is still out there and will need to be dealt with at some point, because these proxies continue to keep showing up, or they keep seeing things that are the direct effects of the big bad evil guy having his way. Burned villages, for instance, or things that affect the loved ones of player characters, or an institution that the player characters favor. These are all things that you can pepper and salt into your campaign so that you keep people fresh on the idea of taking on the big bad evil guy. Now, if the entire thing is about that, that may be exhaustive. Feel free to pepper and salt in a couple of vacation scenarios where the big bad evil guy is not the focus. Side dungeons, fetch quests, there's different things that you can do so the players aren't constantly drowned by the pathos of having to confront this inexorable force. So, that's a guideline on how to use this type of character in your story. It can continue to add focus and sharpness, especially if you have players who like to drift off and do different things. If they're constantly reminded that they're imperiled because of this foe, that wanderlust may vanish, or it may be turned into useful avenues, like finding new and creative ways to fight back. Can't tell you the number of Star Wars games that I've played where they completely went off the rails because the player characters just thought of something better than the story designer did, or the game master came up with. It happens. It's not a bad thing. Channeling that kind of creativity can really lead to an interesting and memorable story. But that is an avenue that the advantage of using the big bad evil guy in a campaign really comes to the fore, because it adds sharpness and focus, and it allows your player characters to feel an extra level of satisfaction as they peel back layer after layer and get closer to forcing the confrontation at the end. Now, another thing that is a common mistake is a game master losing their focus with the big bad evil guy. If you can forget about the big bad evil guy for any real length of time, then you probably haven't been using him right. That big bad evil guy should occasionally show exactly what's at stake in his continued existence. That being usually some horrible reality that the player characters are going to have to deal with. These can be things like atrocities. They can be the destruction of things that they care about, the abduction of loved ones. They can be anything from even an extra tax, which takes away hard-earned gold from the player characters. It depends on really where your players put their value. The big bad evil guy will often have that as their target, and it adds extra punch to exactly the immediacy of dealing with that character. I'm not necessarily saying that this person should be able to crawl into the player character's head and root around. Although that can be an interesting cat and mouse game. The big bad evil guy that's personally destroying the player character is constantly that personal thorn. For an example of that, I'd probably pull from Indiana Jones: The Raiders of the Lost Ark. It starts out with that wonderful opening in the temple setting, and you are introduced to Belloc, who is not a great villain that is one of the epics, but you hate him the moment you see him, because in the midst of everything that Indiana Jones went through, he's completely clean. He's got that ingratiating French accent that just makes you want to hit him. And he just casually takes from Indiana Jones with nothing he can do. He outthought him. But at the same time, he had such a smugness and evilness about him that you just wanted to hate him. And then when you find out he's in bed with the Nazis to continue carrying on his evil work, you end up hating him even more, and the climax becomes more satisfying with him as a villain. Now, you could argue he's not the big bad evil guy, but he is the most persistent opposing force in that storyline, all the way up till the very end. You even feel a little sympathetic for him. You don't think that he's really evil and that he even regrets the partnerships that he's made. But that still means that he is a good opposing force, if perhaps not the big bad evil guy. The Nazis are the big bad evil guy. But Belloc makes a good villain for that story, and a pretty good example of somebody who personally goes in and goes out to ruin the player character's day. A valuable thing that a big bad evil guy can do to add a little extra dagger to the player's spine to really make them hate that big bad evil guy. If the evil is offhanded and casual, it doesn't necessarily have to be necessarily worse, although it helps to ramp up exactly what's going to bother the player characters if it's going to be less personal. For instance, if the player characters are playing good characters, the villain, if, say, he's a necromancer and is raising an army of the dead, doesn't necessarily have to have any personal thing against the player characters. But if the player characters know he's got an army of the dead, they will probably stand against that. It's just a generally evil action, depending on the cultures of your stories, of course. So, generally it's a good idea for the big bad evil guys to be really evil, to eliminate, again, any moral black and white scenario. You don't necessarily want grays. The other thing is that the big bad evil guy shouldn't pull punches either. And I'm not saying they should set out challenges that obliterate the player characters and brutalize them so that you can understand how evil they are. I'm not saying that. But if for instance, big bad evil guy makes things personal and he goes to the player character's hometown, he's probably not going to stop at killing the player character's puppy. Unless the player characters can think of something, or you have a particular reason not to, they may lay waste to their entire family if the player characters have stood against them in any way, shape, or form. Or at the very least, imprison them so the player characters can save them. And it would be a fun, the Final Fantasy trope of coming home to a burned village and everything's on fire. That definitely makes a very memorable villain when they've made that kind of a personal attack against the backgrounds of the player characters. If the players feel that the villain is pulling their punches and not committing fully, that revenge that they get at the end won't be as sweet. That climax just will not have the same punch. Now, sometimes it can be a good idea to look at the players that you are going to be playing with to figure out what the nature of the big bad evil guy is going to be. If your group, for instance, is full of warrior types, perhaps a rival band of warriors, a mercenary company, or a rival king that may lead to some martial climax, a proper battle or war, maybe a better challenge for them, against a group that has a well-balanced blend, an enemy like perhaps a dragon that may involve combat with feat of arms, but also mastery of magic, and other cleverness may be required to take on that challenge. Your players can help you to define who the big bad evil guy is that you want to throw against them. But if you have a story already planned out before the campaign, then you already have a probably pretty good idea who you want as your big bad evil guy. And feel free, of course, to draw from inspirations throughout anything that you've seen, anything that you've read. Be inspired. That kind of resource invokes universal truth that we understand. The players, even if they aren't sure the source that you crib something from, will often respond appropriately when they understand the nature of the struggle that they find themselves within. So if you are going to completely rip off, say, Star Wars, and you have a, well, let's say we'll go with, again, fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons. If you, say, determine that the evil king has a super weapon that can destroy an entire nation at a time, or shrink the scale a little bit. Say it's a control of a Dracolich, a big evil undead dragon. And the players have to go and try to destroy the crystal that controls the Dracolich, or keeps it even alive. And they have to make a harrowing charge on horses through a very narrow canyon while being shot at by goblin archers. Well, I just described the trench run on the Death Star. If they go to have to run through a canyon that leads to a, say, great statue where the ruby pendant is held that keeps the dragon intact, and it has to be there because of, say, magio-astrological reasons. It has to be bathed in the starlight of what it can be done. You could crib from almost any story and tell something interesting. And the players may even recognize the story, and it doesn't necessarily have to ruin it. A certain level of whitewash and creativity can tell a fantastic story. And if you really love a particular story, feel free to borrow. And of course, if you have your own unique thing, using these guidelines may help you build a big bad evil guy with some fangs that, at the end of the story, the players will remember that battle. One other thing I would like to also remind you about setting up the big bad evil guy and the encounter is that encounter, if that's going to be the hallmark of your story, deserves a little bit more effort than most of the other encounters that have built up to that point. If you're going to have a time where you're going to, say, craft a three-dimensional dungeon space, or set up your tiles, or build things, that's the time to do it. With a little creativity, a little elbow grease, and spit and vinegar, you can create an environment that your players will also remember, along with all of the things that were said, the dice that were rolled, the great deeds that were done. That could be a treasured part of their experience facing down your big bad evil guy. And with that, I suppose we can talk about other treasures. And here we are in the treasure room of level 7. I have just come back from Gamehole Con in Madison, Wisconsin. Had a blast. I even on Saturday was there as OmnusI. Had the turtleneck on, the hat on. Nobody recognized me. Channel's not very big yet, and that's fine. Got to meet some great people. Had a lot of fun. Met some of my favorite people on the inside of the industry, people like Jolly Blackburn of Kenzer and Company, Chuck Wright of Frog God Games. My favorite local gaming store was there, so I got to spend some time with the owner, who's a good friend of mine. Got to pick up some really nice art, which if you watch my GameholeCon experience video, I got to show you, but it was a real pleasure to meet some of the artists, some great stuff there. Had a lot of fun. One of the things that I picked up, and I wish that I had picked up a new role-playing game. Usually I like to come away with a nice hardcover book or something. I did end up with Swords and Wizardry Light, which was written by my friend Eric Tenkar, and I'm happy I got that. However, one of the things that I did get that I will bring before you is I got a card game called Geeks vs. Harsh Reality. And it's not complicated. This is Cards Against Humanity set to geek culture. Now, why I'm showing you this is in an effort to, number one, show off what I just picked up, and number two, to add a little level of spice and challenge, is when my player characters tonight got to my table, the first thing I did was I handed them 3 random cards, 3 of the white cards with the answers. And I challenged them to give me the best one for the statement that I picked. And the one who got the best, I gave a small bonus, +1 to their initiative. So 1 extra success against the initiative challenge for Werewolf the Apocalypse. And the game itself, if you've ever played any of the Cards Against Humanity or the clones, this is an example. This is the one, but it's family friendly, which my channel tries to be family friendly as much as possible. But here's an example. My significant other left me because of my blank collection, and you can fill that with my significant other left me because of my overly used and unfunny Monty Python jokes collection. So, for a certain geeky standpoint, which myself and my players enjoy, could be a lot of fun. And that's kind of why I want to express this in the treasure. Oh yeah, by the way, that game came from a group called Total Party Kill Games. Talk to them. Nice group, clever fellows. They make a lot of adventures for pre-existing game series like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, but also they're quite clever at putting out books that fulfill a need that the license holders haven't done yet. For example, they made a book of feats for 5th edition, while Wizards of the Coast is just kind of slowly moving along. On only putting out a few feats at a time. So smart guys, and that's where I got this from. I've enjoyed the little bit I've had with it already. I'll probably do a full review at some point, but so far that's how I'm using it. And again, as a resource that you can use in your own games, something like that takes up very little time. It took about a minute to resolve that, and we had some fun with it, got everybody off on a good tone, competing with each other, but at the same time playing another game inside of the game with each other. And you can do things like that all the time. Don't let it get too involved so that it distracts from the game, but something like that is a great way to break the ice, tell everybody, okay, it's time to stop talking about out-of-stuff game. This is a game that we're playing now, and get everybody in the framework of getting ready to adventure and tell a story together. So that's my treasure for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. We are now at the end of level 7, which means that you are to be commended and rewarded. Tonight, you have rightfully earned yourself 15 character points. I'm sure you're looking forward to spending those. I also found, I'm guessing that this poor soul must have explored some deep cave before the imps completed the level, but I did find a skeleton, and he did have a bag on it, and once a day that bag burps. It actually disgorges a chicken when it burps. So it's effectively a bag of endless chickens. Haven't played around with it very much, so if you get a chance to, I'm giving you the bag. Make sure you put it down on your character sheet. And who knows what other abilities it might have. But you'll never be without chicken. And that's a good thing. I am OmnusI, and once again, thankful for you spending your time with me here in the dungeon. I hope I was entertaining and that I may have given you something to think about when constructing your own dungeons and creating your own villains. Thank you for your time and safe adventures.